Yes, Anup, we are live. We are live.
Good afternoon, all. Thank you all for joining us today. In today's webinar, we have an esteemed guest, Mr. Ajit Menon, the CEO of PGIM India Asset Management. Ajit oversees all aspects of the asset management business, including mutual fund and portfolio management services. Ajit is responsible for the direction of the business and its growth strategy. As a dynamic and result-oriented leader, he brings to the table keen analysis, insights, and a team approach to drive organizational improvements and implementation of best practices. Ajit is an industry veteran and brings over 2 decades of leadership experience in business strategy, distribution, sales, and marketing. He joined PGIM India from Tata Asset Management Company, where he was head of strategy. Prior to Tata AMC, Ajit spent over 15 years with DSP BlackRock, where he played a key role in the growth of the business. He's associated with key industry bodies and is a sought-after speaker at various domestic forums and conferences. He has authored papers on matters pertaining to the AMC business, co-designed a 6-month certification course in wealth management, and a 2-month retirement readiness certification course for business partners. Welcome, Ajit, to today's webinar. I'm so glad to have you on the panel. Ajit, PGIM is a newer AMC in India. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Sure, Anup. Firstly, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm happy to be here with all of you and all of our viewers. As you mentioned, Anup, PGIM is a new brand as far as many of the Indian investors are concerned. But let me tell you that PGIM is nothing but Prudential Global Investment Managers. This is the Prudential of the US, and it's an over 140-year-old entity in the world. So a very experienced asset manager. And PGIM itself it is the 10th largest asset manager in the world. So that is one easiest description to give about PGIM. Manages over $1.5 trillion of assets globally. That's a little about 100 lakh crores that it manages itself. Actually about 109 lakh crore. To just put it in perspective, the entire mutual fund industry in India is currently 33 lakh crore and growing well. It is, been very well known for its performance across the platform of its equity and fixed income products. It is the fastest growing active manager in the world. And it has over 1,300 investment professionals, working for it. So one advantage I have in running PGIM India here with my team is that I do get a lot of insights and thought leadership articles and content from our parent in the US. And given that things are so global, things that are global affect everything, here in India, and for investors in India, it is a big, advantage to have. Of course, a lot of people today, while they don't know about PGIM, and if they know it as the Prudential of the US. Many people know about Prudential of the UK, which is in India as ICICI Prudential. Very different companies, two different, no connection between the two. But we are a very large entity, and technically, we are probably the largest multinational brand in India in this particular space. But as PGIM India, we have a long way to go. But thank you for having me here. So I'll hand it over back to you.
Thank you, Ajit, for that introduction of PGIM. It looks great. As you all may know, Scriptbox is India's most trusted digital wealth management service. At Scriptbox, we believe that good investing is not just about choosing a fund. It's about understanding your aspirations and goals, building a portfolio and managing it actively so that you do not compromise on your dreams. We are a SEBI-registered investment advisor. We keep sharing insights, ideas, and content on a regular basis on topics related to investments, aspirations, life goals, leadership, and health. Please visit our website, scriptbox.com, social media platforms, and channel Scriptbox on YouTube. If you like this webinar, do tweet about it mentioning the handle Scriptbox. We have recently launched international stocks offering through our partnership with StockAl. Please check this out on our platform. When we think of the army, the only 2 words that come to my mind are immense respect. Because of the army, we feel secure and can sleep peacefully at night. My sincere gratitude to each and every army personnel for keeping our safety above everything. What sometimes we do not realize is that the army has also given us many innovations and ways that we can adopt in our normal lives. DARPANET, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, was funded in the late 1960s by an arm of the US Defense Department with a purpose to link computers at Pentagon-funded research institutions over telephone lines. This evolved into what we know today as the Internet. Amongst many such things is Zed Kit Bag, Army's mission planning framework. Captain Raghu Raman has said that the Army's lessons are written in blood because mistakes come back in body bags. So it is important that the framework is robust. Army's Zed Kit Bag framework can be applied in many, many situations. अभी तो असली मंजिल पाना बाकी है, अभी तो इरादों का इम्तिहान बाकी है, अभी तो तोली है मुट्ठी भर जमीन, अभी तो तोलना आसमान बाकी है. Whether you want to run a marathon, or you want to begin your startup journey, or want to invest, or anything you want to do in life, you need to have irada and tariqa. When you are building a portfolio, the irada are your life goals for your portfolio. Tariqa is asset allocation and product selection. Having a framework, a tight sequence while planning your investment journey is essential because mistakes can lead to financial disasters. Today, Ajit will show us how to use it to navigate investment biases, what irada and tariqa are required there. Over to you, Ajit, for Zed Kit Bag framework.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anup. And you laid the groundwork perfectly for me with your perspective on the Army, and I share that with you completely. So welcome once again to all the viewers here today. As Anup mentioned, the Zed Kit Bag is the Army's mission planning framework. And if you watch some of Captain Raghu Raman's videos on YouTube, you will probably hear him speak about Zed Kit Bag as well and about its ability to be used in various circumstances, whether you're a startup or whether you're setting out on any kind of mission. I've always had a positive bias towards the Army. Always wanted to be in the Army myself, but here I am, the mutual fund business. But I've kept in touch, and I thought that this is a great way to bring the concept of some of the common mistakes that we may make while we go in our investment journey, and how is it that we can probably use the Zed Kit Bag framework to mitigate some of those risks. So let me dive into the presentation. And in the presentation, the first thing that I want to talk about is actually something out of Indian mythology. And there's an interesting twist to it when I come to it, but I'll tell you, why I have picked up that little leaf of mythology. And then we will talk about the Zed Kit Bag and how you can use the Zed Kit Bag to really win in the mind as far as the investing game goes, and maybe make some conclusions at the end of it. So let's go right ahead and take this leaf out of mythology. I'm quite confident that most or all of you have read the Mahabharata, heard many stories about the Mahabharata, or watched it on TV, like most of us probably have. And we are all familiar with the story of the Mahabharata. But there is something called the esoteric meaning of the Mahabharatas, a hidden meaning in the Mahabharata itself, where it tends to describe an individual, a single human being, and the fight that is going on within ourselves. And how does one interpret it? Let me take you through that. We all know that Dhritarashtra, the king, was blind. Now, in the esoteric meaning of the Mahabharata, Dhritarashtra, the blind king, is associated with the brain. Our brain, our center of processing all of our decisions, all of what we do, all of what we think, is essentially blind. It doesn't get to know things itself. What it does is work, acts, reacts to all the impulses that it gets through the nervous system all across the body, right? So by itself, it is blind, and it is influenced through all of the impulses that it gets from outside and inside the body. And many of these impulses could be negative influences and biases that keep us from achieving our true goal. And therefore, the 100 Kauravas. They are considered the negative influences and the biases. There are 100 negative influences and biases that can influence your brain. But then how do you control this? How do you win this? In comes the 5 Pandavas. The 5 Pandavas are really representative of your 5 senses. Every human being has just 5 senses of sight, smell, hearing, taste, and touch. So if you are awake to your 5 senses, and if you can control your 5 senses, you can win over the Kauravas, or rather the negative influences that attack you as a human being or attack or influence your brain. But the 5 senses itself on its own or independently is not something that can possibly help. It needs to all come together. It needs purpose and it needs passion. And that's where Draupadi comes in. The character Draupadi is representative of the passion that keeps the 5 brothers together, or in an esoteric sense, the 5 senses of a human being together to fight against the Kauravas. I'm sure you would have guessed Krishna. Krishna is the soul, the conscience of a human, and the guiding sort of principles, the values, the things that are in our software, in a manner of speaking, that guide us forward. So Krishna is that soul. But the most interesting aspect when you think about the story of the Mahabharata related to a single human being and the sort of fight that goes on inside of all of us is, who is Karna? Because for all of us who know the Mahabharata, we know that Karna was the eldest brother, was part of the 5 Pandavas actually, or rather the first Pandava in a sense, because coming from the same mother. And the answer is that Karna represents the ego. Every human being has an ego. From a baby to an adult, we all have our ego. And it is said, therefore, in the Mahabharata, maybe through the story, but one part of ourselves has to be killed if we have to win the spiritual and the game of life. And that is, if you can at least subdue or kill the ego. Ego is the one that tends to lead most of us into many of the problems that we have in our personal or professional life. So just to conclude on this very quickly, our brain is essentially blind, and it's influenced by 100 different negative emotions, influences, and biases. But the 5 senses, with the help of an able Sarathi, can win over them. And you have to get rid of the ego if you really want to win the ultimate war. I don't know how much of this you will agree with, but I find it a very interesting perspective to just think about, how intelligent were our ancestors when they weaved these stories, and one could make connections to what is happening in our own lives. With that, let me jump straight into the Zed Kit Bag, which is also a framework to try and help understand what is possibly happening to us in various scenarios of our investment and savings journey, and how can we take care of it. Now, of course, I want to give credit to Captain Raghuraman. He's the one who I remember reading many, many years ago about an article that he had written on the Zed Kit Bag. And it struck me then that it is such a beautiful framework that it can be used for a lot of purposes, especially when it comes to planning anything specific. Of course, Captain Raghuraman has 11 years in the Indian Armed Forces, more than a decade in corporate life. He was the first CEO of the National Intelligence Grid and has been group president at Reliance Industries. He's the author of Every Man's War, and he's a fellow of the Observer Research Foundation. I'd love to hear him on TED Talks or any of the other videos that you can probably catch. But as Anup mentioned earlier, one of the sayings that, one of the quotes that I read about Captain Raghuraman, which I like very much, is that the Army's lessons are written in blood because mistakes come back in body bags. The reason I want to introduce the Zed Kit Bag framework into our investment journey is because of this. As Anup mentioned earlier, mistakes can cause financial disruption and ruin. So you can't afford to make mistakes. You've got to guard against mistakes. You've got to guard against the risks. So your planning framework, the only thing that you can control, as they say, control the controllables. You can't control the market. You can't control people's opinion, but you can control your process. So if you have a strong process and framework, you're much likelier to win at what you are attempting to do. Let me quickly take you through what the Zed Kit Bag stands for. It is obviously an acronym, some of which Anup mentioned, but let me take you through the whole. Z stands for Zamini Nishan. K stands for Khabar. I stands for Irada. And mind you, all of this is a sequence when it comes to planning a mission as far as the army is concerned. T stands for Tarika. B stands for Bandobast. A stands for administration. And G, the most interesting of all, stands for Ghadi Milao. Very quickly, when an army is setting out on a mission, it has to first study the terrain. Where are you going to operate? You need to know where you're going to operate so that you are completely ready. Just as a startup, if you're going to do a business, you may have a great plan, but you need to understand the context and you need to understand the environment in which you're going to operate. So this is nothing but the theater of war in which an army or a mission is being done. And you got to know whether you're going to operate on mountains, in the sea, on, in a desert or lakes or in the forest. So you need to know your zameen. The next is khabar. Most importantly, information about the enemy and information about yourself. So you need all the intelligence that you can get before you can launch into the mission. So the next important step before you go with your guns blazing is to make sure that you have all the right information with you. Irada is the third step. Once you know the terrain, once you have the information, you better fix your goal, what is the actual goal of the mission? Are you going to be capturing a peak and that you need to be capturing that peak by, say, a particular time? Or you're going to blow up a bridge, or that you are going to, bring back your colleagues across the enemy line? What is the mission? And it's very important for the army to be very clear about this, because the troops on the ground, most of them are not likely to be, highly intellectual or educated forces. And so it has to be simple enough for them to understand and execute. That can make all the difference between winning or losing. The next step, of course, is tariqa, as you can rightly understand. The technique, the strategy that you will adopt to fulfill that mission. What is the technique? And once you know the technique, you then get to bandobast, which means I know the technique. I know now what is the bandobast I need to do? What are the resources I need? Do I need air cover? Do I need artillery shelling before I enter into the field? And what kind of equipment do I need? All of those comes in bandobast. Administration is the logistics part of it, including the metrics of measurement. There has to be somebody not necessarily only in the field, but back at the headquarters, who's measuring progress of that mission and making sure that things are going step by step and to plan. So the logistics and the monitoring is the second last step. The last step is Ghadi Milao, which means that every soldier that is going on that mission needs to synchronize their watches with the watch of their commander. It's a very important step, because if the commander is going to give you instructions which are extremely precise, time-based, that there is artillery shelling that's going to start at 6:45, 06:45, as the army would say, your watch can't be 10 minutes behind. You will be in the theater of war when the shelling starts. You can't afford to do that. So you need to be synchronized. And being synchronized is the last step. So with that, let me take you through how you can use the Zed Kit Bag in your investment journey, and use this framework to understand the risks or the biases that can affect you, and what are the questions you should be asking yourself so that you can mitigate that particular risk, or you can win on every step of the journey. So let's start with the first one, Zamini Nishan. As I mentioned, the Zamini Nishan is nothing but the theater of war or terrain. And the job, I think, for an investor here is, when you think about the terrain of investments, is simply to familiarize yourself with that field of play. What are all of the things that you're going to be involved with? And familiarizing yourself with the whole territory that you're entering into is the first step. Of course, to me, I think it is that, where you're going to play is both the Indian economy and the global economy, both of it, because your investments are going to be impacted by what's happening, not just in India, but all over the world. And I think the pandemic is a perfect example for all of us to think about it as well. So let's think about investing. And why are we saying this? Investing is about buying businesses and becoming an owner. Investing in equity especially is about buying businesses and becoming an owner. What is the definition of a good business? A good business's simplest definition is that it is a continually growing business. Growing businesses, more often than not, or almost always, is actually leveraging talent and human ingenuity. And human ingenuity and innovation is global. Today in the pandemic, when you sit around and you're watching Netflix, it's a streaming business and it started off somewhere in the world. A fantastic innovation, whether we think of Uber or many other such services which we use here today in India, is the result of great innovation, not just technology being leveraged for it, but human creativity, human ingenuity, and human innovation. So when you therefore think about this, one step that you should be worried about, or the risk or the bias that you may have in the first step of your investing journey, is that you may have the home bias. And a lot of investors have it. If you picked up the latest report from the Reserve Bank of India, it would tell you that 99.99% of investments across Indians are in India. And very, very few people think about investing internationally, even though that opportunity is there and there are many routes. And Anup just spoke about Stockle a little while ago as well. So we've got to think about it that, India is a $3 trillion economy, but there's a, $90 trillion economy out there in the world. And even if you look at market capitalizations of what is over here in India at 2.5 or $86 trillion or, closer to 90 over there internationally, why would you just invest in the 2.5 trillion when, you could potentially invest also in the 86 trillion, global market cap that is out there? So the question that anyone should probably be asking in this step is, how narrow or wide is my playing field? That's one of the first steps. Before just jumping in and saying, hey, let's do this and let's do that, let's figure out the theater of war, the field of play that you are entering. Let's look at the next step, cover. And I spoke about it. It's information on the enemy, on oneself. And I feel that from an investor's perspective, what I'm trying to talk about over here is, do you have actionable intelligence? Just having a lot of information is not enough. Do you have actionable intelligence? And that's where I'm sure, Scriptbox, for instance, comes in to give you some of those actionable intelligence. But let me also say that, it's your, you've got to think about your filter to gauge your enemy. And in your investment journey, your enemy is inflation, volatility, taxes, and your personal biases as well, right? Those are your enemies. And, for me, when I think about it, inflation is very central to it. And the reason why I think inflation is central to it is because interest rates are connected to inflation. And when interest rates change, it does impact both equity and fixed income and almost all of the other asset classes that you would be investing in. So to me, that's quite central. Higher inflation will mean higher interest rates and vice versa. Higher interest rates is good for savers, but bad for business. And lower interest rates may be bad for savers, but it's good for business. Already, when you have actionable intelligence, you know which way you need to maybe tilt. And I'm sure most of you are thinking interest rates are down. The money in the bank is not earning too much. Some of the fixed income investments are not earning too much. And I think this is simply the connection that you make. And if you have good intelligence, or I'm saying actionable intelligence about the enemy, then you are able to take some decisions. But let's look at the bias. The bias that comes when we talk about information is herd behavior. Just too much information from all sources. And I'm sure most of you will agree with me that in a digital world, and as they call WhatsApp University, you have so many things thrown at you and information coming to you that it only tends to confuse you. It only tends to, make you feel, what the hell am I supposed to do in this?
I was about to mention that
this
just
is
about the WhatsApp, a lot of information being available, and
too much,
and how do you make it
right?
actionable, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. How do you make it actionable? So in this, I think the question that you need to be simply thinking about is more common sense than anything else, but to say, how do I differentiate between fact and opinion, right? Because most people tend to give their opinions. And I think while it's good to hear, because you may follow some of those people and you like some of those people and they're experts, that's fine. But also try and see if the facts of it. Sometimes opinions are just opinions, right? At the end of the day. And I think the kind of content that sometimes Scriptbox puts out to all of you, and I've seen some of it, gives you a good understanding and information about what's happening with facts and figures. And that's very helpful when you're trying to take some decisions as well. So actionable intelligence. The next step is irada, the mission statement or the objective. And this is a simpler one to talk about because, as you would know, this is goal, all your goals. And it is very, very important that you approach investments with a sense of a goal in mind. And your goals could be short-term or they could be long-term, but goals have to be SMART, S-M-A-R-T, SMART, right? Specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. If the goal that you've defined for yourself does not measure up to any one of these factors, it is not a goal. I mean, well, you could say, when you start your job saying, I'm going to buy a Ferrari for myself and that's what I want. Well, it's not wrong. It's quite specific and you can, measure it. And of course, you could achieve it as well. I wouldn't say that nobody can achieve it. You could achieve it. It's not being unrealistic, but then, hey, what's your time frame and how, right? So you've got to think about whatever goal you have in a clear way. And I do think that the SMART formula, or being specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound, is a good way of defining what your goals could be. I personally think that retirement it should be your priority number one. I tend to talk about retirement as financial freedom because I think retirement is a fuddy-duddy old word now. The more, PGIM India has done a retirement readiness survey in India, and the feedback we get is people today, or the millennials or the new investors, don't think about retirement in the way the older generations used to think. They want to work forever. But what they would like to think about is financial freedom. It's just another word for retirement, right? So that you are financially free, your source of income is taken care of, so that you can do whatever you like with your time, your passion, your hobby, or the thing that you're most interested to do in life. The reason I, however, keep retirement as I would like people to have retirement as the first goal is for a slightly different perspective or reason. Retirement is the only financial goal in your life for which you do not get a loan. Let me repeat that. Retirement is the only financial goal in life for which you do not get a loan. All your other financial goals, you want to buy a house, you want to buy a car, you want to start a business, you want to send your kids for a great education in India or abroad, have a fancy wedding, whatever it is, there's a loan for it, but no loan for retirement, right? And so it's important that you save early for retirement and that, you make that corpus your first number one priority. The bias in this step of irada or planning your goal is recency bias, right? Loss aversion bias. That's another term for it. And it is a bias where, the most recent big negative or positive news will impact your decision making. Here you are on your journey to set up a nice retirement corpus over the next 15 years. 2 years in, there is a pandemic and the market corrects and you've stopped your investment, you've taken your money out and you're sitting in the bank and, you're scared, you're worried. And the most recent event that's happened, big one, either negative or positive, can affect you. And it can affect your goals. So it is important for us to think about when you're taking a decision, saying that, okay, what's making me take this decision, right? There's something bad that's happened in the market. It could be a global financial crisis. It could be a pandemic. I mean, those are huge ones, and they will affect your decision. But when you think about what decision you want to take, do take that decision on the basis of the time frame of your goals, and then take that call. If you're very close to the end of your goal, yes, you need to take some decisions quickly. But if you're far away and you have time, you could take your time to decide what is it that you should be doing. You don't need to do what everybody else is doing necessarily. That's the point. And I think the question, therefore, that I would think you should be asking on this step is, how aligned are your priorities? I mean, do you have a list of priorities, and do you know what's first, second, third, fourth, and fifth? And so when you're in that investment journey, are you able to take some of those decisions on where you want to reach first, and then second, and then third, just like it would be in a mission? Let's move to Tariqa, which is simply the strategy and the tactics. To me, I think from an investor's perspective, this is the step where you're thinking about mitigating your risk. And enhancing your return, of course, is the other side of the coin. But whenever we think about returns, when we read in the papers that funds are giving great returns, markets are giving great returns, whenever you think about returns, please remember that it's only one side of the coin, and the other side of that same coin is risk. And therefore, you need to be thinking about, are you getting risk-adjusted returns for where you are headed? So mitigating risk is the strategy step. And to me, I think that from any investor's perspective, he or she needs to be thinking about these 5 things: protection, saving, investment, tax, and then wealth transfer. And it's very important. And then you think about the different asset classes that you have in your strategy, that you can build the building blocks of your strategy. You've got equity, you've got debt, you've got gold and precious metals, you've got commodities, you've got currency, you've got real estate, and then you have a whole area called alternates. And in alternates come things like venture funding and the startup. You could be a private equity or a hedge fund, or you could be investing in paintings. You would be a lover of art and you understand art. You're investing in a young painter or an established painter. It could be philately, it could be antiques, or it could be Bitcoin. It's the alternate asset class, right? Of course, currency, some people say, is not really an asset class, but I've used it because I think you can use it as well. So the 7 asset classes, these are your building blocks. And the most important thing from a strategy perspective, and I think this is the one slide which people would think about, okay, so what's the strategy? I think from my perspective, if I were to advise anybody and in my family or my friend circle or any one of you, I would say, please remember the sequence. You've got to start with protection. You've got to make sure that your insurances, your life, your health, your property is all well taken care of first. And I'm thinking about a person who is starting off on their journey of life as their first job, and thinking about being a good investor and creating wealth over a period of time. Or if you're in the middle of the journey, it doesn't matter. You've got to think about your protection first and your insurances of all kinds, right? Because you're protecting, in a sense, your source of income for your spouse and the people who depend on you. That's important. The second step in the sequence is saving. And here I mean having an emergency fund. Having an emergency fund that's maybe 6 months or a year of expenses that you will need, and putting that away in the bank or in a savings account or a liquid fund or a mutual, a low risk mutual fund, whatever that might be. Then thinking about investment, and then thinking about tax, and then thinking about how are you going to transfer this wealth on to your kids or your family at the end of it. That's the sequence. And I think that sequence is extremely important to keep in mind. Don't jump straight into investments without having completed the protection and the savings step. Don't worry so much about tax when you're thinking about investments. Think about investments for investment's sake. Even income tax, the word income tax, income comes first, tax comes second. So think about the income that you're going to create and then think about the tax that you're going to pay. Don't be obsessed about it too much. And then, of course, you're thinking about wealth transfer. Apart from sequence, which is important, Anup mentioned asset allocation. The proportion that you will put into these 7 different asset classes or building blocks, so to speak, is extremely critical. Some of you may have a little more in equity and a less maybe in gold or currency. Some of you are likely to have too much in real estate. I'm sure you'll recognize it amongst your friends, or maybe, maybe 10 years ago, 5 years ago, if you asked anybody, everybody is overweighted on their real estate, second homes, investment homes, what have you. Not so much the case today. But this whole aspect of, being too overbiased to any one asset class is a danger, and that's not strategic. What strategic is, for your age, for your risk appetite, think about these 7 asset classes, and do you have money spread in most or all of them? And of course, whatever is your tactics, you build your downside protection. What is the risk here? What is the bias that is going to hit you? The bias is something called risk perception, and it's different from individual to individual. It's about overestimating or underestimating the probability of your bet. Sometimes you're so confident that real estate is the only way to go. I mean, forget your markets, forget everything. This is what you should be doing. You're stupid. Your advisor's stupid. Or sometimes it would be, look at the equity markets. Man, this is the future. And, all of your money goes into, or at least
what we call it as overconfidence bias also sometimes.
It is.
Especially what I've seen in markets, when markets are high, then people tend to become more confident about the markets. So the risk element goes down, or perception of risk goes down. And when the market is down, then the perception of risk goes up. So there's also market movements also kind of changes the perception of risk. Yeah.
Right. And Anup, it affects everybody, right? So it's not as if I'm sitting here and saying it and as if I don't have.
Yeah, we all are kind of,
we are all affected by it, fund managers, individuals. It's just that, when you're in a profession and you're thinking about it, you as an advisor or my team as a fund management team, they know that the process is the king. So when they decide that, a certain valuation is too high or that it's attractive, that's when they take their action. And otherwise, most individuals who may not have a framework or who may not have a process or who may not have an advisor may tend to get more affected because of some of these biases, a little more than us or people like us. So the question
they're checks and balances, basically.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to have those checks and balances. Easy to say, very difficult to do. Quite commonsensical again, but it's quite difficult. But I think the easier way to think about it is, ask this question about how diversified and how sequenced is your whole portfolio. If you can just ask that question from time to time, and whatever answer comes to you, I think would be the right one. The moment you see that you're too overweighted on something, you will automatically realize that you're not diversified as per your age or your risk. And that really is a very, very individual thing. Most of us experts in financial media, people, when we give advice or when we talk about markets, or personal finance advice, it becomes very general. And we've got to realize that every individual household will have their own unique needs. Somebody may have elder parents at home, somebody may have a special child, somebody may have just gone through a divorce. It's very different. So it's important that an advisor can sit with you and you can chat about it and find out, okay, how do I go about doing something like this? So let's move on. And I'm coming to Bandobast, which is the resources that you have, that you put together. And slightly, sort of out of box here, maybe from what you may be expecting. But personally, I think that personal health and well-being is your biggest strength and your biggest resource. You don't have good health and well-being, almost everything else is senseless or useless. You can create the best wealth in the world, but if you're going to be stuck in a bed or because of, whatever you're ailing with, or, how are you going to enjoy that wealth? What does it all mean, right? So personal health and well-being, according to me, is a resource. It's your bandobast. That's the first thing that you work on. If you think about the greatest wealth destroyer or income destroyer for most common people, it is something to do with health at the end stages of their life or their, as they get older. And the expenses of health is, rising. Medical science has increased to a point where they can keep you alive, and your loved ones will want to keep you alive, and they will simply want to spend just to make sure that you can live. And sometimes it just destroys a lot of wealth. And I think we've seen that during the pandemic as well. So I think personal health and well-being is your first resource. The next is your personal philosophy. Having a personal philosophy about risk, about what you will do and you will not do, the extent to which you will bet and not bet, and what you think about investments and savings is your personal approach, and that should be good enough. Your personal skills is also a bandobast for you, because that is one of your sources of income. That's your primary source of income. Your skill is what is getting you your income as a doctor or as a lawyer or any other professional that you might be. So working on your skills, upgrading yourself is clearly another bandobast that you should do. And of course, you can have multiple sources of income. You could be getting some income from your family or from your investments or from any other things that you may have, some hobby or talent. So these are, according to me, the bandobast or the resources that an investor should have. But there are some things in the financial world as well. And for the financial world, there is insurance, there's mutual funds, there's PMS. There is the liberalized remittance scheme where you can, an individual can have $250,000 that you can invest abroad every year, financial year. And, things like international equities, as Anup mentioned, can, go through that route as well. There are loans. There's, of course, pension, there are wills, there's direct equity, there's AIF. So, all of those are your resources for you now to think about how is going to fit into your strategy, which we spoke about as the earlier step. And, how the strategy is tuned to your goal based on all the actionable intelligence you have on the field of play that you're going to be as an investor. So that's the sequence we are going through. And I believe that in this step, diversification is the only mantra that tends to work. I mean, the best of the experts, obviously, everybody loves to look into the crystal ball and think about what's going to happen next, but something comes out of left field and you don't know what's going to happen. So control the controllables, your process, and one aspect is diversification, which is important for a lot of people. For very, very, very sophisticated investors, sometimes diversification is not something that they believe in, because they've reached a point where they realize that they want to concentrate the bets that they want to do, because that's where real wealth is created. Well, I guess if there's a lot of money, you can play some of those rules as well. But what I'm talking about here is more a general rule. Again, like I mentioned earlier, tend to generalize. There will be people on both ends of the spectrum for which something may not work or may work. But diversification, to me, I think for most of us would be the best way to deal with this. Any concentration in any one single asset class that we spoke about earlier, whether it's equity or real estate or debt or gold or alternates, it can be a killer. So let's look at the bias when it comes to the bandobast part of it. Okay, the bias is called being captivated by stories. Okay, so sometimes we make poor decisions in allocating our resources due to all of these, compelling stories that we hear. We hear about it and we think about it, the advertising that hits us, Sarutake Geo, and, so it affects us, it impacts us, and we feel, hey, this is great, I need to do this. And so sometimes it's a story, it's a beautiful story. And you got to just check yourself to say, what's the story that I'm being captivated by here? And I hope that I'm not putting all of my eggs into one basket or going after one story alone. So question, straightforward, how are stories influencing my selection of the options I have? Let's come to the second last one, administration. The metrics of measurement, the monitoring, the frequency of review. Most ideal, have a benchmark and have a time to goal. These two things are very important when it comes to the step of administration. According to me, from an investor's journey perspective, I would either take the bank FD as the benchmark and not, just because I'm invested in equity, I take an equity benchmark necessarily. Of course, you can do that. Or you can take the nominal growth rate of a country and an economy as your benchmark, because if you're investing and taking risk, you're supposed to get something better than what the aggregate economy is doing, or economy is doing on aggregate or on average. But I think a bank FD is a great benchmark to have, because if you weren't doing anything with your money, you're going to be sticking it into a bank deposit probably, and so that's what you compare against and see if you're doing, if you're doing well. I would say and caution you that while I do think inflation is the most important thing to really get a grip around and understand, every household will have their own little inflation. So even if you read in the newspapers that the inflation is 5.5% or 6%, it may be different for you. You could have college-going kids, and if they're going abroad, for sure, the education inflation is very high. Or if you have anybody with needing medical attention at home, you know that your inflation is probably higher than somebody who does not have that. So keep these things in mind as you think about your benchmark. And the bias that is likely to affect you is something that I would call result orientation, which means the propensity to judge a decision by only its end result. So, when you're sitting with an advisor and you're looking at your portfolio, and this is 3 months after the pandemic, and you're saying, hey, but what happened? The portfolio is down 14% or something like that. You're just looking at it you're judging it in a very short window. You may have taken this decision 5 years ago that you've got to put some money aside for the next 15 years for starting a business, right? But don't judge that little outcome just because what's happened in the last 3 months from the, hey, in the December report said something else, but the March report is saying something else to me. And why is this? And, I'd simply say that while it's an important question that you will obviously be asking your advisor or yourself, I think it's not something to obsess about or spend too much time about. I think what's important, therefore, is to ask this question: what was the premise of my decision making at the point I made it? And do most of the factors which I considered while taking that decision, are those factors still relevant today? If those factors have changed, by all means, go ahead and change your tactic. But if those factors haven't changed, don't react to the situation. Because if you react, you're likely to be caught out. And maybe you don't know when's the best entry point back or, in, and, you get, it then throws the whole plan off, possibly. So
yeah, you can never time the market. And what also happens sometimes is that when you see, like, for example, in the last 1 year, markets have really gone up. But you may be investing only 20% of your portfolio in equity or 30%, because the framework of risk that you showed, right? First, you have to make sure that you protect, then save, then invest. So you will not see those kind of returns in your portfolio because you are only investing 20%. So it's your situation, personal situation can be quite different.
It's different.
And that's where it is important to understand that.
You're absolutely right. And I do think, therefore, that, the more important aspect here is that at the point of taking a decision, you would have considered 4 or 5 factors, some assumptions about, what is going to be maybe inflation, or, what's your time to goal and why are you doing this and things like that. You've got to just judge when, at a later point when you're doing a review, because administration is about the metrics of measurement and the frequency of review. When you're doing that review, just revisit the same factors that on the basis of which you took that decision, and figure out whether, it's all the same right now. And only if those things have changed, would you then move forward in taking a decision. So let's come to the last step, Ghadi Milao, which is about synchronizing, as I mentioned, synchronizing with the commander. And it's also about being disciplined. I do think, like Krishna or a Sarathi, having a trusted third party to guide you is quite important for most people. I'm sure there are a few people who have the time and the intelligence and the competency to do things yourself. But I think for a bulk of people, for most people, it's always good to have a trusted third party to guide you. And the reason for that is because money decisions have very strong emotional influences, especially when you are trying to deal with your own money. You're going to be very, very either too conservative or too aggressive, and you need a good trusted sounding board. And when you are gauging an advisor, or when you're talking to an advisor, at the end of the day, the foundation of that relationship is trust. I have read this in many expert sort of commentary that trust has a formula. Trust is equal to empathy plus integrity plus reliability plus competency plus credibility. Any one factor here goes out of the window and trust goes out of the window. Okay, you could have a very empathetic person dealing with you who understands you very well and maybe even is highly, has high integrity. But, well, if they don't have the competency, you're going to have a problem. But maybe, he's extremely competent, but what if he's not reliable? So, every single factor matters in trust. And so whenever you do decide, and when you talk to your advisor, when you sit down, I guess it's a two-way process, but you need to build trust. One of the biases that you can have in this final step, and Anup, you mentioned that earlier, is overconfidence, which is the belief that we know how to control the market, which is essentially random, and we know it. At least in the short term, it's quite random. So I think overconfidence is something that affects all of us. All of these biases affect all of us, and overconfidence is the one that you need to be guarding against when you think about this final step of synchronizing yourself. And I think the question to ask is, how synchronized are you with your plan? And if you're in sync with your plan and your advisor is also in sync with that plan, I don't think that you are going to have too much of a probability of risk or loss for too long. You're going to recover, you're going to do well, and you're going to meet your wealth goals. So let me quickly summarize here in this slide. We talked about Zamini Nishan is your terrain, Khabar your information, Irada your goal, Tariqa your strategy, Bandobast your resources, administration is your review process, and Gadi Milao is, in a sense, your discipline. The challenge when it comes to the terrain is you're likely to have a home bias in a very narrow field. Go ahead and widen the scope of what you want to do. When it comes to information, you got to guard against herd behavior, and chasing returns is what happens when you have herd behavior. Make sure that you have all the filters we spoke about for getting actionable intelligence. As far as your goal is concerned, your bias could be recency. Anything that happens in the recent past, good or bad, could affect your decision. Make sure that you're well prioritized around your goals. Your strategy could be affected by your risk perception or, sort of oversimplifying things. And I think the best way to take care of that is your asset allocation. When you think about the resources that you will use and you will bring into this, make sure that you're not getting captivated by some beautiful marketing, story. Take it, don't take it at face value. Think about it. If it appeals to you, sure, by all means, you can go ahead, but, apply some common sense along the way. I'm sure all of us do that. And I think one way to think about your resourcing is also to make sure that you're well sequenced. Administration, your bias could be just having too much result orientation and reacting to it. Think about your decisions when you took them in the first place and review if those factors have changed. Only then change. And the last is that you could have overconfidence in trying to control something that's really random, have a plan, and be in sync with that plan. Let me also say that when we think about all of this planning and the Zed Kit Bag framework, it is also the army who says that the battle plan is the first casualty of war. So you may have a fantastic plan, but it's when you get into the ring, you're going to go, all guns blazing. Sometimes you don't think of the plan. It happens to the best of us. But I think just being planned will have you more prepared than the next man, and that's essentially what you're trying to do. And I was reading a Morgan Housel piece recently, and this is more for people in the beginning of their financial journey. If all of that, Zed Kit Bag framework was too much to even, it may sound very interesting, but, still thinking about it, then here's what Morgan Housel says is the best way to go towards your wealth, especially if you're starting off, right? Number 1, spend less than you earn. Number 2, save the difference. Number 3, take the help of a trusted advisor and invest in a diversified portfolio. Number 4, have patience. That's it. That's the only 4 steps for anybody who's starting new. And that's by Morgan Housel. I couldn't have said it, or nobody could have said it more simpler and easier. A lot of people find it difficult on step number 1 and step number 4. Just spending less than you earn is sometimes tough with all of what's around us, and it's made it so easy for us to click and buy today. So it's difficult, and of course, having patience is very difficult as well. So thank you very much for the time that you have given me. I'll open it up to Anup and the team at Scriptbox to see if there are any questions. This is one of my favorite quotes. People do not decide their futures, they decide their habits, and their habits decide their future. So happy investing, and I hope that a little bit of the army's got into you as well. So thank you very much, and I'm going to stop sharing here. Anup, over to you. I hope that was good.
Thank you so much, Ajit, and wonderful laying that framework in the investment landscape, I should say. Yeah. So, and you're right, first punch you get, right, and the plans can go awry, right? So it's very, very important that we stick to the plan and we keep revisiting those plans, like you have said. And I'm not going to summarize.
There's a nice one on this one where a journalist was interviewing Mike Tyson before one of his great bouts, and the journalist asked Tyson that what's your plan, what's your strategy when you're going into the ring, and Tyson happened to tell the journalist, everybody has a plan till you're punched in the face.
Until punched in the face. Yeah, exactly. So that's what happens. So no, wonderful, and all the biases that you talked about, and biases are so important in investments, and it's to be, and we all, like you said, even though we are experts, and we would like to believe that we are not biased, but actually we are also, right? But what also happens in our cases, because we follow a process, there are checks and balances, it helps us at least curb those biases.
Absolutely.
So it's very, very important to be aware of those biases, and thank you so much for laying down that framework. There are some questions, Ajit. So we have some few minutes, so I'll just take quickly some questions.
Sure. Sure.
Since we talked about valuations and all, should I enter the market at these high valuations?
Well, if you thought of the framework here that we were speaking about, I think the question I would ask you is, what is your goal and what is your time frame to that goal? Valuations will not matter if you are if you're investing for the next 10 years or 7 years or 15 years for a particular goal. It will matter only if you are thinking about a short-term goal for which you are thinking of entering into the market. And when we think about valuations of the market, also remember that it is in aggregate. It's the valuation of the aggregate market. There could be various pockets within that market which may not necessarily be at stretched valuations. It's the job of a fund manager, therefore, to look at those valuations and see whether it is way out of whack, and then decide the right portfolio to build. So to me, I think that I won't be able to answer that question completely, really without knowing what's your time frame. If you have a long time frame to your goal, don't worry about valuations. Worry about your asset allocation and whether you have any equity at all, or you don't have anything. If you don't, any time is a good time to enter the market. You can be in a fund that your advisor can help you with. Scriptbox can help you with possibly. And as I also mentioned, valuations could be different across the market. So a good professional advice or a portfolio actually helps you get over it. I will also add that valuations are because prices have run up with a lot of money entering the market, whereas earnings have not yet caught up. It is mostly what you will hear experts talking about is that now that we have come through the second wave, and the fact that we feel that we possibly may be better prepared, even if there is a third wave. Let's all hope so, and I hope that will happen. Then there's more predictability now coming up, and therefore there's possibly more predictability of earnings as well. And when earnings catch up, some of this will automatically readjust to where it is. But what's important is to make sure that you have the right advice and you have the right portfolio for your specific situation.
Yeah, it's important to have that goals, right? So always keep in mind the goals and don't get knocked out with the first punch of the market, or if the valuation goes high, that what is happening. So just taking the leaf out and of the Mahabharata playbook. And many times it helps to have that Krishna, right? The advisor, the Sarthi for your portfolio,
right.
which is very important. And you talked about that in Gadi Milao. And the risk management is the most important thing, right? So the valuation, when you manage the risk, then the higher valuation, lower valuation will not really matter, because you're really kind of sticking to your asset allocation plan. You're sticking to your goals plan. You're sticking to your investment plan. And accordingly, and of course, if you have an advisor to support you, then they will also handhold you through those through that journey.
It helps.
Since we were talking about biases, how to tackle biases which comes from short-term goal, either to invest in risky asset or safer asset?
To me, I think that the way to think about your goals is, not being stuck with that bias is, as I had mentioned earlier, to prioritize your goals. So, when you're thinking about prioritizing your goals, because, you have limited savings or money kept aside to do something, then you've got to be very clear about your priorities. If you think that you have this, couple of lakhs of rupees and that's really much of your savings, and you think, my God, I think that people are making money in Bitcoin. Shall I do it? Because, it seems to be on fire and maybe I'll make some money. And, in priority, actually, there is something that you would need to do for yourself in terms of maybe, following a hobby or a business or something for the family. And you're taking a big risk then if you are taking a short-term goal based on very, very recent information. So if you prioritize your goals, and if you say that, listen, come what may, this is my goal number 1, 2, 3, and 4, then whatever's happening in the short term, I think it'll automatically come in perspective for you, whether you should be indulging in it or not indulging in it. And it's a tough one. It's very easy for me to speak about it, but every individual will struggle with it. I think asking the right questions, I think sequencing your portfolio, as I mentioned, first make sure that your protection requirements are done, your emergency funding is done. If both of those are done, you could take a little bit more risk because you're now entering into investments. If those first 2 steps aren't done, don't get swung by something short term. So sequence and priority of your goals, I think that's the better way to sort of approach it.
Yeah, there's something called as risk ability, or ability to take risk, and willingness to take risk. So when we are talking about that sequence, it's the ability that we have. Then there's a psychological aspect, which also has the biases built in, right? The willingness to take risk. So when you have the more ability to take risk, then you can probably go higher in equity. And but of course, you should not be bothered by the volatility of the market, right? So that also kind of plays on people's minds.
The third aspect, the third aspect there is risk capacity. So risk ability, risk willingness, and risk capacity. You may have the capacity, not the ability or the willingness, or sort of vice versa. So these are, I guess, more jargons that behavioral finance experts will build into it. But as I mentioned earlier, every individual situation is unique. My personal advice is, as I spoke about earlier, think through your sequence and think through your priorities. You'll pretty much arrive at your own answers, which will be good for you. You don't need anything else there.
There are a couple of more questions. I'll quickly take them and then we can wrap up. Present situation, we can withdraw or keep up still in long-term investment capital. What's your suggestion? I think it's related to that high valuation question only. So again, what we would say is that it's according to your asset allocation and diversification and your risk profile. And if you have a long-term view, then these short-term market movements is not something that should matter. But yes, if you have an advisor, definitely that advisor would help you in guiding the path, guiding your path. Then there's one question: how to plan for different goals with different timelines, and what should be the instrument to be used, stocks or mutual fund? This goes to financial planning. So you need to kind of do your financial planning with different goals, with different timelines. And what instruments to use, again, it depends upon what asset classes are suitable for your risk profile and for your particular situation. So it will be sort of customized, or it can be very specific to personal needs. Anything you want to add there, Ajit?
Yeah, I can probably add 2 things. One is that, and again, I'm going back to the presentation where I talked about the tariqa and the strategy. And the fact that you have these 7 asset classes: equity, fixed income, gold and precious metals, commodities, currency, real estate, and alternates. The way I would think about it is that when you are faced with this question, for instance, that is the present markets too expensive? Should I get out? I mean, should I book my profits, or what should I do? I will go back to exactly what you said, Anup, which is that, what is your asset allocation? How is your money divided between these 7 asset classes, or at least 6 of them, or 5 of them? And then take your decision. If you think that in your asset allocation, your equity is looking quite big, book some profits, move it maybe into gold or fixed income, or into something like a real estate investment trust or REITs that you can buy in the market. So you have some exposure there. If you think you're already having a lot of exposure to real estate, then choose something else that you can get into. But essentially diversify based off, as Anup mentioned, your risk and what your existing asset allocation is. And mind you, when you're thinking about it and you look at your, let's say, just your equity investments, equity itself, while I've talked about these 7 asset classes, you can drill down into each one of them, right? For instance, when I say real estate, it could be residential, commercial, or land. Similarly, when I'm talking equity, it could be large cap, mid cap, small cap, it could be passives, it could be, international equities. You have so many different possibilities under each asset class. Gold is not gold alone, but precious metals, gold, diamond, platinum, they're all legitimate investment classes. So if you think that your investments have sort of ballooned and you're a little uncomfortable, look at that equity, stay put in equity if you have to, but just make sure that you have enough diversification within equity itself. Because one of the common mistakes that I do see, or let me not call it a mistake, I'd probably say people don't realize it, is the overlap. You might be holding 6 different funds and thinking you're pretty safe. You look at the underlying portfolio and the top 5, 7 stocks are exactly the same across all of those funds. So if you could get that information, it's not so easy for somebody to get it. You've got to invest some time and energy, or check with your advisor, which they can definitely help you with. Make sure that whatever you invested in has lower overlap with each other. That at least guarantees you a little better diversification.
Yeah, it's a very important point that you make, Ajit. Sometimes having all 5-star funds may not mean that you've got adequate diversification, because they may have the same underlying holdings, exactly. Right? So, and exactly. those funds are good, right? But if you choose all 3 of them,
yeah, absolutely.
Essentially, you are just choosing the same wine into 3 different bottles, or whatever. No, so same investment.
Correct.
With 3 different Correct. Names, right? So it's very important to look True. At that overlap analysis is also very important. Absolutely. I think we are out of time, so I'm going to wrap up, sure. Ajit. What is my biggest takeaway is that one thing that you started with saying that when you make decisions with the brain, right? The brain doesn't know what decisions it is making, actually. It's a very important concept. And I read it somewhere sometime back also about this. And I was also intrigued by the whole fact about how does it work. But it also kind of leads to that we have biases. So please be aware of those biases, right? So Correct. Just because we feel that we are rationally taking a decision, and there is a concept called rational economic man, but actually that irrational exuberance or disappointment can always happen, and tends to happen a lot in investment. So be aware of those investment biases. So thank you so much, Ajit, for those valuable insights and relating the Zed Kit Bag framework to investment or biases in investments. Viewers, if you have further queries, please contact your relationship manager or use our website, scriptbox.com, to get answers. For all your financial and investment related requirements, please download our app. Do visit us on various social media platforms and subscribe to our channel, Scriptbox on YouTube. If you have liked this webinar, do talk about it on social media platforms. Like I mentioned in the beginning, we have recently launched international stocks offering through our partnership with StockAl. Please check this out on our platform. Thank you to all the participants for joining us today. We hope to see you again in our forthcoming webinars. This is Anup Bansal from Scriptbox, wishing all of you the best of health.
Thank you, Anup. Thank you for the opportunity. And let me also wish the best of health to everybody, all viewers. Stay safe. I only have Captain Raghuraman and people like Morgan Housel who make it very simple for us to understand this very complicated journey of saving and investing. I hope you found it useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.